From left to right, Charles Darwin, Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, Sigmund Freud. 4 people whose ideas have shaped the thinking of the beginning of the long 20th century. Their most enduring sound bites are, arguably, again from left to right, I've called this principle by which each slight variation, if useful, is preserved, by the term of natural selection. The ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. I do not set up any new idols. May the old idols learn what it is to have legs of clay. There is no natural opposition between ego and id. They belong together, and under healthy conditions cannot in practice be distinguished from each other. In the second half of the 19th century, Darwin, like Copernicus, rocked the foundations of a theist society by replacing the model of creation found in the Bible with a scientific explanation that radically restructured man's importance in the world. Marx's base and superstructure theory allowed for the critique of ideas as dedicated to supporting a specific set of relations between the means of production and those controlling those means. Friedrich Nietzsche's anti-idealism at the end of the 19th century represented a crisis in Romanticism and classicism and a rejection of eternal values. To Nietzsche's name I would also add the name of the 20th century thinker Ludwig Wittgenstein, someone we will explore later as being responsible for the radical changes in post-war thought. Sigmund Freud's theories in the first years of the 20th century meant that man was no longer ruler in his own house, driven instead by hidden and conflicting drives. In many different ways, the ambitions of many, but by no means all, of the artists of the long 20th century, from 1880 onwards, are a synthesis of these ideas. Art explores a world in which the traditional religious model is brought into question, where ideas and art are brought into play as a form of propaganda by the ruling aristocracy and upper middle classes at the end of the 19th century, and artists can use the discourse of art to liberate themselves from the materialistic grasp of a mechanistic society and create a personal spiritual vision. Or later, for those dedicated to using art to critique the possibility of constructing any original, higher or eternal vision. Really, art is a way of seeing the world and therefore of changing the way you see the world. I justify making this course about the long 20th century and starting in 1888 because the work of the most accomplished artists alive in 1900, Monet, Cézanne, Gauguin, has its origins in the 19th century struggle of art. Also, it seemed wrong to exclude the works of Vincent van Gogh from a consideration of the 20th century. A previous video included a quick survey of something called the Barbizon School, a group of artists dedicated to a landscape art that refused to idealize nature or man's relationship with it. On the contrary, tried to capture a sense of immediacy with it by painting en plein air or in the open air, and Barbizon artists were very influential on the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists. Corot was painting with the flattened tones which Edouard Manet, we'll see his work in a few slides, would use in a very self-conscious way to make statements about art's relationship to reality. Bourdin, featured here, was Monet's mentor, teaching him to capture transient effects of nature, and Millet's attempt, seen in the previous video, to realistically capture the relationship with nature of those who worked on the land, thereby making a political statement, was an inspiration for Van Gogh. Edouard Manet is widely credited with being one of the turning points in the development of modern art, with Paul Cézanne and Marcel Duchamp being others. Which is the first abstract artwork is controversial, but Kandinsky is often cited just for abandoning figurative titles in 1911. A word about terminology here. Abstract doesn't refer to whether a work of art looks like an object from the world. That's really about naturalism. Nor does it refer to choices about what to depict. For example, idealism choosing to look at beautiful landscapes, realism choosing to look at working conditions in mines. So figurative means the artist intends the work to depict an object from the world, whether it looks like the object or not. Abstract art is the abandonment of this attempt. Pablo Picasso rightly pointed out that Cubism is not abstract art. His guitar from 1911 may not look like a guitar, but it is intended to depict one, hence the title. The previous video showed the series of revolutions in France in pictures. The French Revolution of 1789, that of the storming of the Bastille and the guillotining of Louis XVI 4 years later, was represented in David's tennis court oath. The July 1830 revolution to overthrow Charles X was represented in Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People, and the July uprising of the same year was made famous in Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. The 1871 Paris Commune, after the defeat of France in the Franco-Prussian War, we'll see later represented in Manet's The Barricade. However, February 1848 saw the overthrow of Louis Philippe and the June uprising in Paris as part of a wave of revolutionary uprisings in over a dozen countries in Europe. Edouard Manet was in Brazil in 1848, but returned to study art at the time Napoleon III seized power and implemented a strongly conservative society, which had an effect on officially sanctioned art. Essentially, classicism was the accepted style, reflecting as it did the principles of aristocratic rule of ancient Greece or of emperors ruling Rome. The strongly conservative character of the salon jury led to protests from progressive artists, and the emperor agreed in 1863 to a salon des refusés to show works which had been rejected from the salon. Although the works were strongly criticized in the press, it set up an independent salon system organized by the artists themselves. Edouard Manet, whose most famous works are arguably his Olympia and his Déjeuner sur l'herbe, was inspired by Baudelaire's poetry in his approach to modernity. Manet responded with painterliness, contemporaneity, and a sense of irony and play applied to the academic tradition, appropriating compositions by other masters, Raphael, Titian, Rubens, Velázquez, and Goya among them. These two Renaissance works by Titian, the Fête Champêtre, which roughly translates as Garden Party, and the Venus of Urbino, were important models for the Déjeuner, or picnic, and Olympia, respectively. Although the actual poses in the Déjeuner are from Raphael's design for a Judgment of Paris, engraved by Marcantonio Raimondi. However, both Marcel Proust and a close friend of Manet's confirmed that the Titian painting had been the original inspiration to do the work. This then is the Déjeuner sur l'herbe by Manet from 1863, accompanied by the entry into the first Salon des Refusés. The painting would have been fairly shocking in its modernity, both in terms of the flat handling of colour planes and in the subject matter, a nude outside the acceptable setting of classical mythology. Olympia, likewise, was identified by most contemporary critics as a prostitute, especially since the cat replacing Titian's faithful dog was the subject for a sexual pun, or a euphemism for a prostitute. Although Olympia was painted at the same time as the Déjeuner, Manet did not exhibit it in the Salon des Refusés until 1865, conscious of its scandalous nature. Again, when Manet drew this sketch of a summary execution of communards from the suppression of the Commune in 1871, he was drawing on his own works of the execution of Maximilian I of Mexico, a puppet emperor who had been installed by Napoleon III but abandoned to his fate, and hence the works were banned in France. This work was in turn based on Goya's 3rd of May, seen in the previous video. The Salon des Refusés, as mentioned above, paved the way for salons independent of the official salons, for example the Impressionist exhibitions from 1874 onwards. The previous video also touched on the Impressionist revolution, particularly in terms of colour, and here is a museum piece, one of Monet's later palettes. Over a decade after the first exhibition, Monet followed the exodus of artists looking for the southern light. Monet struggled with its intensity to execute what he said he found to be the most difficult paintings of his life, but for me, they're the most memorable. The move to the south had been initiated by Paul Cézanne, whose family had moved to Provence when he was 20, and so it was here that he returned to during the Franco-Prussian War. Cezanne is credited as being one of the fathers of modern art, borrowing the Impressionist palette but taking their experiment in brushwork further to turn the canvas into a unified motif through the use of a unified scheme of translation of the world into geometrical colour. The poet Rilke's assessment was, it's as if every place were aware of the other places. In Cézanne's words, reported by Joachim Gasquet, you see, a motif is this. He put his hands together, drew them apart, the 10 fingers opened, then slowly, very slowly, brought them together again, clasped them, squeezed them tightly, meshing them. That's what one should try to achieve. If one hand is held too high or too low, it won't work. Not a single link should be too slack, leaving a hole through which the emotion, the light, the truth can escape. You must understand that I work on the whole canvas, on everything at once, with one impulse, with undivided faith. I approach all the scattered bits and pieces. Everything we see falls apart, vanishes, doesn't it? Nature is always the same, but nothing in her that appears to us lasts. Our art must render the thrill of her permanence, along with her elements, the appearance of all her changes. It must give us a taste of her eternity. Cézanne criticized Monet for being merely an eye, that is to say, seeing colour and reacting to it. No matter how talented the hand, there was for Cézanne no inner vision that was projected. Monet was reacting to the outside world mediated by his eye. Cézanne was in effect the first artist to transform the world of the canvas into his internal subjective vision of the world through the application of paint. This transformation is perhaps clearest in his series of paintings of Mont Sainte-Victoire, about 10 miles east of Aix-en-Provence. We can see in this detail how Cézanne has constructed a unified motif by balancing each stroke of colour against contiguous strokes, and so on, until the entire canvas relates to all the other parts in terms of brushstroke, colour and tone. Vincent van Gogh. His biographical details, as written by Van Gogh in his honest, frequent and long-standing correspondence with his brother Theo, shows two main preoccupations, art and the infinite. His career started in the art world, working for the dealer that sent him to London. There he became a preacher, and this missionary phase of his life continued for 3 years or so, at which point he decided to become an artist. His early work in the Netherlands is proof enough of his vision, but upon arrival in the south of France, his canvases explode into an inner vision of colour and brushwork. Van Gogh hoped to set up an artists' commune in the Yellow House in Arles, but the failed residence of Paul Gauguin coincided with Van Gogh's first breakdown and his being committed to an asylum in Saint-Rémy. From his window he painted what is probably his best known work, among his most intense, Starry Night, which corresponds to a theme that recurs in his letters to Theo, that of the infinite. Here in this work, also from Van Gogh's interment at Saint-Rémy, we can see Van Gogh's affinity with Cézanne's method, wherein the canvas becomes a unified expression of an inner vision through the application of colour in balanced brushstrokes, a motif. His linear brushwork was inspired by Japanese art as well as Neo-Impressionism from the 8th Impressionist exhibition. The contiguities of Gauguin's art with Van Gogh's should have made them ideal collaborators. Gauguin was preoccupied early in his career with the spiritual life in rural Brittany, before eventually seeking sunlit exile in the south, in Tahiti. They both employed a palette in which brightened colour made their canvases shine with a transcendental otherness. However, Van Gogh's reaction to this portrait of him by Gauguin, "It's certainly me, but me gone mad," was what, according to Gauguin, prompted an argument in which Van Gogh threw a glass of absinthe at Gauguin's head and caused Van Gogh's breakdown a week later. After Gauguin left Arles, he asked Vincent to give him one of his sunflower paintings. 8 months after Van Gogh's suicide, Gauguin departed for Tahiti, where he would remain, except for 2 years in France, until his death from a combination of syphilis and laudanum 12 years later. Many of Gauguin's Tahiti paintings used Polynesian art and mythology of the Arioi society, who worshipped a deity, Oro. Several prints exist for this woodcut, and the more heavily treated ones show the details more clearly. A female figure on the left, sitting on a beach lulled by waves, combing her hair, surrounded by disembodied deities in the Polynesian style. Some other prints, such as this one, verge on the abstract. Gauguin had copied the Tahitian chant of creation into his Ancien Culte Maori notebook of 1892. The text speaks of the void and the god Tāroa, who transforms himself into the shell of the immense universe, with rocks, sand, sea, and sky.